is Dr. Bernadette Waterman-Ward, who is Associate Professor of English at University of Dallas and the Graduate Director of the English Master's Program. She's a longtime member of the association and board member as well, and has research interests, of course, in Newman, but also in Georgia and Hopkins and many other things. And she's going to present to us today on a word in season on Newman's poem, which will also be the title of our journal.
Okay. Matt.
Wait, did I mess up your title?
Well, Matt, I can present on a word in season. I'll just go and pull it out. You had on the program that I was going to do Gerontius in Time of Plague. I preferred to do the word in season paper, so I'll go grab it if you want me to get the word in season paper.
Sorry.
Actually, why don't we take a vote? Okay, do people want to hear about Gerontius, or do you want to hear about a word in season?
Gerontius.
Okay, Joseph Pierce is on Gerontius.
Well. I'm teaching Gerontius this semester, so.
Okay, so people want to hear about Gerontius. Okay, Matt, you should have adjusted the program if you want, but the word in season. All right, that's okay. I looked at the program and said, okay, they want the Gerontius paper. All right.
Sorry about that.
We'll do Gerontius because Joseph Pierce wants it and somebody else is teaching it and it was on the program. All right. So.
All right, I'm going quiet. I'm muting mine. You take over.
All right. The dream of Gerontius deals with fears that we've lately known. Fear of death. Fear of the unknown. Someone is sharing the screen. Okay.
Continue.
Matt, what was going on there? Matt Muller.
Someone was sharing the screen. I'm not sure who accidentally did that, but I turned it off.
All right. Thank you.
So you're clear.
All right. Okay. All right. The dream of Gerontius deals with fears we've lately known. Fear of death, fear of the unknown, fear of the devil, fear of God. In the first of its 7 parts, Gerontius feels the horror of death. Then he dies. In the second, he feels unsure of where he is and what's going on. This uncertainty that we all know. He doesn't even know whether he's in his body or not. Then he meets his guardian angel. He converses with angels, hears from devils, and then in the 5th part, there's something else about fear. He asks why he's not afraid to meet the judgment. He learns that it is because he did fear the Lord when he lived. In the most profound section, the 6th, Newman shows what the nature of purgatory is. In the last section, the soul comes to rest in the desire for God, desiring the pain of purgation, which we heard about yesterday if you were in session C. The poem has been sometimes taken by critics as a kind of political justification of Catholicism, in particular, the position of Catholicism in relation to Anglicanism, because its topic is purgatory, which was forbidden by the 39 Articles. But despite the questions of the Anglican establishment, that broaching the subject of purgatory brought up, it's not a political poem. It's really a devotional poem. And it's really very deeply about the individual and his relation to his body and his relation to his soul. It's about, finally, deep in it is not just the project of purgation, but the question of the resurrection of the body and of individuality. Newman, of course, was himself close to death on many occasions. He learned to face it with equanimity. In the most relevant to our time, besides his being denied the sacraments in Malta when he was in quarantine, which is something that we understand something of. In 1849, Ambrose St. John and John Henry Newman went into the stinking slum of Bilston in the ecologically devastated Black Country of England's manufacturing belt. The parish priests there were overwhelmed. There was a cholera epidemic. Cholera is devastating and rapidly devastating. Within 3 days, a victim was a grayish, hollow-eyed corpse. The best science of the time asserted that it was airborne. There was no such thing as personal protective gear. Some priest was needed to give last rites to the families of Irish laborers who were hopeless in the plague, and Newman volunteered. Newman's Birmingham parishioners wept over him as he left. They thought he was just going to his death. Bishop Ullathorne, who had intended the task for younger hands, commended their heroism. And witnessing the heroism of the Catholic priests was a huge contribution to the conversion of Henry Wilberforce. By the way, how is my vocal quality? Should I wear my earphones and it's okay? Good, okay. All right. In 1865, Newman published his poem about facing death, The Dream of Gerontius, in the Jesuit magazine, The Month. Some critics found the imaginative soliloquy of the soul of Gerontius as he realizes that he has no body, the most moving thing. They thought that this was the most enormously imaginative thing. And this relation of soul and body is important. The moment of separation fascinates modern critics too, but because of the lack of theological knowledge among literary scholars, the interpretation sometimes renders Newman's attitude toward death far less comprehensible. So, critic Rebecca Raynoff argues that Newman used the form of death consolation poetry in The Dream to accomplish broader goals that resonated beyond individual comfort. His poem moved readers from private solace toward a larger easing of public tensions. The idea that it's basically political. Like the heroic witness of Catholic priests during the Pestilence, when they simply disregarded their own safety and looked to the spiritual good of the people. The poem did soften prejudice against Catholics, but it was not by his conscious plan that Newman's poem in the Jesuit magazine was so compelling to Protestant readers. He simply was very moving in embodying Christian orthodoxy in the work, as noted by Charles Kingsley, of all people. This was after the Apologia thing. Despite very fine technical analysis of the use of soliloquy and the dramatic time of the poem, Raynoff misreads the poem as touting a common Victorian theme, the conflict between spiritual progress and egoism that Tennyson and Browning imagine in their poems. No. She thinks that Gerontius becomes a nameless soul in purgatory in a process of de-individualization, by which the poet can enact a central principle of his conception of purgatory, the cleansing of self-interest and the purging of individual persona. That's not what purgatory is about. That's not what Newman's purgatory is about. He's not being cleansed of his individuality. And in fact, this is a misreading of even the Victorian idea. Take, for example, the horror of Tennyson at the idea of losing one's personal identity after death. It's This idea of losing one's individuality / selfishness is hardly a source of Victorian consolation. Listen to Tennyson. That each who seems a separate whole should move his rounds, and fusing all the skirts of self again, should fall, re-merging in the general soul. Is faith as vague as all unsweet? Eternal form shall still divide the soul, the eternal soul from all beside. That's in memoriam. They were desperate. The idea of the loss of individual being roused overwhelming fear and angst. It drove Victorians like Elizabeth Barrett Browning to seances to escape the horror. The poem's power does not stem from any appeal to Victorian platitudes about unselfishness, and still less from any idea of erasing personal identity. It's true some Victorian sages like George Eliot actively disapproved of heaven because it was so selfish to expect that you'd get individual recompense for virtue. But Newman disagreed. And his poem aims at being bracing rather than merely consoling. He's not interested in softness here. It focuses on hope of meeting God rather than on the putative virtue of disdaining hope, of not wanting any reward. Newman is about hope. Gerontius is no everyman. He preserves emphatic personal identity through the entirety of Newman's poem. A priest attends him at his very moment of death and immediately begins the Sub Venite. His gathered friends are equipped to join in the responses to the prayers. This argues for a set of unusually pious friends. Very few Catholics get that kind of deathbed assistance. Once he's dead, Newman calls him the soul of Gerontius rather than Gerontius, not because he's stripping him of individuality, but for a good theological reason, implied in Gerontius's speech as he faces dying. As though my very being had given way, as though I was no more a substance now, and could fall back on naught to be my stay. Help, loving Lord, thou my sole refuge, thou, and turn no whither, but must needs decay and drop from out the universal frame into that shapeless, scopeless, blank abyss, that utter nothingness of which I came. A substance has unity of action. For instance, hydrogen is a substance, and so is oxygen, but so is water, where they act as one. Sodium is a substance, and so is chlorine, but salt is another substance. So a body is one thing, and a soul another, but man as one substance requires both body and soul. His soul does not die when his body does. Though the body shall be resurrected, Gerontius sounds almost Heideggerian in his angst over his nothingness. But has the soul individuality without the body? Newman had long before written of the bodiless dead. Their works do follow them. They are incomplete, inasmuch as their bodies are in the dust of the earth, and they wait for the resurrection. And yet, in some unknown way, that place of rest has a communication with the world, so that disembodied souls know what is going on below. Newman wrote in his sermon, The Immortality of the Soul, in Parochial and Plain Sermons 4, that every soul must live with himself forever. This is God's gift, and it is good. As Gerontius dies, his friends wisely pray for him to escape from the sins that are past, from thy frown and thy ire, from the perils of dying, from any complying, with sin or denying his God or relying on self at the last. They beg protection from even the slightest yielding to evil, from any complicity even without active involvement in sin. Any little thing can have vast consequences. It's like the margin of error in a space flight. He's in more serious danger than death. The rhythm here is an irregular 2-foot line. It's echoed in the demon's mocking later. A very sensitive study of Newman's technique once considered whether meters reflect the moral state of the speaker and concluded rightly that they do not. However, they do reflect the species. When devils or angels are talking among themselves, they speak in this 2-beat rhythm. The roughness of the 2-beat lines here refers most likely to the irregularity of sin in a spiritual being, and it's emphasizing that he is becoming only a spirit. Part 2 begins with his confusion at having a self with no body. From here on, the protagonist is a soul missing the source of information by which he makes decisions, his senses. All information henceforth is directly impressed by God upon his faculties of imagination. The angel explains that Gerontius is not precisely having the experiences that he feels he's having. He's getting a sort of translation of another reality into the sensory imagery that he's used to. Of course, all the man's decisions have now been made. Everything from here on will depend on God's grace. There is a sternness in living in translation, but the first thing you notice is the sternness of the introspection. He's alone with himself. Then God's grace provides a relationship. Someone has me fast within his ample pall. This is not God directly, as it seems to some critics. It's the guardian angel of Gerontius, who, impressively, can hold Gerontius in one hand. The angel sings in the rhythm of the resurrection hymn by Palestrina. It is the 2 beats, but it's far more regular. This resurrection hymn by Palestrina had only recently been translated, like 3 years before, as "The strife is o'er, the battle won. My work is done, my task is o'er, and so I come, taking it home, for the crown is won." The angel rhymes. Gerontius speaks mainly in blank verse. Then, when he speaks of Gerontius, the angel moves into blank verse, moves into pentameter, not blank verse, because he does rhyme. He alludes to Ezekiel's account of helpless, endangered humanity. He lay a groveling babe upon the ground, polluted in the blood of his first sire, with his whole essence shattered and unsound, and coiled around his heart a demon dire, which was not of his nature, but had skill to bind and form his opening mind to ill. The imagery employs some of Newman's highest diction, echoing Shakespeare. O man, strange composite of heaven and earth, majesty dwarfed to baseness, fragrant flower running to poisonous seed, and seeming worth cloaking corruption, weakness mastering power, who never art so near to crime and shame as when thou hast achieved some deed of name. Because the angel is so impressive, and because he's not feeling compelled to worship him, the soul realizes that he's dead. It's taken him a while, he's never had any source of information but his body. And so he naturally thought he was still there. He realizes his position as the angel sings allusions to the Magnificat, where Mary celebrates the Incarnation. So the question of the Incarnation is in the background the whole time. The question of the value of the body. So part 3 begins with our hero addressing the guardian in awe. Angels are not comforting for Newman. They're impressive. They're, well, as in the Bible, the first thing an angel always says is, "Don't be scared," and then goes on. So Gerontia says, "Mighty one, my lord, my guardian spirit, all hail." Then the angel responds to him as if an equal, "My child and brother." In 4 speeches, they discuss the kind of time the soul is living in, a necessary fiction for the poem's discursive structure. Then at the center comes Newman's religious purpose, when the hero asks about the fear he had expected to suffer after death. "Dear angel, say, why have I now no fear at meeting him? Along my earthly life, the thought of death and judgment was to me most terrible. I had it aye before me, and I saw the judge severe, even in the crucifix. Now that the hour is come, my fear is fled, and at this balance of my destiny now close upon me, I can forward look with the serenest joy." The angel responds, "It is because thou then didst fear, that now thou dost not fear." I have rarely met anyone who has the fear of death and the idea of Christ as judge, well, gazing at the crucifix. The angel praises his unusual and very particular brand of piety. Note that even with this degree of virtue, the soul will need purification. Still, Newman implies that the fear of God, which the poet himself learned during his keen, terrible adolescent brush with death, remember when he was 15 and he was converted to Calvinism, and God's absolute power and his nothingness. Well, now he sees that that fear of God is the beginning of heaven. Then they hear from hell. Demons are howling at them. The soul is surprised because he's not afraid of them as he was while dying. Newman's demons, like the damned potentates of hell and Paradise Lost, cling to their dignity. They say, "Of the high thought and the glance of fire of the great spirits, the powers blessed, the lords by right, the primal owners of the proud dwelling and realm of light, dispossessed." Then Newman dashes the romanticism about wrecked grandeur with a plunge into bathos in diction. They start to talk about how they were chucked down, and they criticize psalm droners and canting groaners. So the angels, the fallen angels, think of their dignity, but in fact they have none. Newman's guardian angel describes how trapped the demons are within themselves as they enviously brag about their freedom. And in particular, we see them obsessed with hatred of the human body, a bundle of bones which rattle and stink. Newman was emphatic about the dignity of the human body and its permanent connection with the soul. He wishes to, as he says in the development of Christian doctrine, direct attention to a characteristic principle of Christianity, whether in the East or in the West, which is at present both a special stumbling block and a subject of scoffing with Protestants and freethinkers of every shade and color. I mean the devotions, which both Greeks and Latins show toward bones, blood, the heart, the hair, bits of clothes, scapulars, cords, medals, beads, and the like, and the miraculous powers which they often ascribe to them. Newman cites the dogmas of the incarnation and the resurrection and says, as a first consequence of these awful doctrines comes that of the resurrection of the bodies of his saints and of their future glorification with him. Next, that of the sanctity of their relics. Further, that of the merit of virginity. The union of body and soul in the person is why, although a pure spirit has no sex, one refers to the soul of Gerontius as he. His body can never be alien to his spirit. Impatient to see God, he yet realizes, I am not worthy e'er to see again the face of day, far less his countenance, who is the very sun. Not less in life, when I looked forward to my purgatory, it ever was my solace to believe that ere I plunged amid the avenging flame, I had one sight of him to strengthen me. The angel tells him that he will see God, but it's going to hurt. Again, Newman gives us this kind of dramatic irony. It's really pleasant. And then at the moment when he's been told it's going to hurt, you get angelic beings singing a hymn about salvation to interrupt them. Concluding, though, with lines about penance after death. Then the angel explains the soul's coming agony. This is the heart of the poem, the nature of penitential suffering. When the soul sees Christ, the angel says, the sight of him will kindle in thy heart all tender, gracious, reverential thoughts. Thou wilt be sick with love and yearn for him and feel as though thou couldst but pity him, that one so sweet should e'er have placed himself at disadvantage, such as to be used so vilely by a being so vile as thee. There is a pleading in his pensive eyes, will pierce thee to the quick and trouble thee, and thou wilt hate and loathe thyself, for though now sinless, thou wilt feel that thou hast sinned, as never thou didst feel, and wilt desire to slink away and hide thee from his sight, and yet will have a longing eye to dwell within the beauty of his countenance. And these two pains, so counter and so keen, the longing for him when thou seest him not, the shame of self at thought of seeing him, will be thy veriest, sharpest purgatory. Gerontius feels himself ready, and the angel takes him to see a sight that opposes the devil's scorn for the body and for human fear. The angel sings of God incarnate, embracing human existence and human terror. The angel, the created being who accompanied Christ in the Garden of Gethsemane, is present in eternity with the incarnate God's eternal consciousness of that moment. Amid the garden shade, the great creator in his sickness saw soothed by a creature's aid and agonized as victim of the law which he himself had made. For who can praise him in his depth and height, but he who saw him real amid that solitary fight? Angelical beings sing then of the demons' false triumph, which had been prefigured earlier in their lies about their own dignity and freedom, their lies about the human body, and their disparagement of the proper aim of hope, the divine reward for virtue. After this sight, the soul comes to its judgment and hears the assistant still praying for him. This is a reminder, among other things, of the particularity of the life of Gerontius on earth. He still has his individuality, he still has his friends. Then again, he is about to suffer by seeing God. The angel of the agony chants Newman's meditation on the mental sufferings of Jesus in his passion. Shuddering dread, cold dismay which sickened thee, that pang of heart which thrilled thee, Jesu, by the mount of sins which crippled thee, Jesu, by that sense of guilt which stifled thee. As the reader remembers the suffering that God incarnate endured to save his soul, the soul goes before his judge, who is that God incarnate. The description is vivid. The eager spirit has darted from my hold, and with intemperate energy of love, flies to the feet of dear Emmanuel. But ere it reached them, the keen sanctity, which with its effluence like a glory clothes and circles round the crucified, has seized and scorched and shriveled it, and now it lies passive and still before the awful throne. O happy suffering soul, for it is safe, consumed yet quickened by the glance of God. Gerontius wants to suffer purification because God wants it. Happy in my pain, he calls himself. In part 7, the number of perfection, the souls in purgatory sing the song of Moses, the man of God, who separated the seas to free Israel from slavery. Newman means to teach his readers what to fear and when to fear and where to go for refuge. He's not trying to reconcile us to our dissolution. He doesn't whitewash uncertainty or pain. The dream of Gerontius celebrates not merely the purification of the soul, but the particularity of its relation to the body. It is not reassurance of calm and rest, but a bracing call to piety, as potent as that of the soul of Gerontius, who despite his faith and the loving care of his Savior is still scorched and shriveled by the fire of his glance. And yet, because the poem asserts an individual relation with God and individual reward, it is laden with the hope of the kind that Newman found in the words of St. Cyprian in the famous plague of 252. Newman quoted them in tract 79. Let him fear death, who has not been given an interest in the cross and passion of Christ. Many of our people are dying in this pestilence, that is, are delivered from the world. And what is truly a plague to enemies of Christ is to God's servants an end, bringing salvation. He calls the plague, with its terrors, with its sadness, with its uncertainties, with the prospect of seeing God. He calls the plague a mercy vouchsafed to us. Thank you. I'm open for questions.
Yeah, okay, thanks so much, Bernadette. So, we have about 15 minutes for questions. So if anyone wants to kick it off, you could raise your hand and unmute yourself. We'll figure it out. Who'd like to go? All right, Bernadette, then I have a question for you. That's sort of, so for Newman, in Dream of Gerontius, what struck me this last year looking at it, really for the first time looking at it closely with some students, was the passage you just recently read of the angel explaining purgatory and the last line of the shame of self at thought of seeing him will be thy veriest, sharpest purgatory. And so I was trying to emphasize to the students, it seems that Newman's idea of purgation is caused by seeing the face of Christ. Like this is the purgative, I guess, event. And my experience with sort of other afterlife journey kind of the tradition is, the purgation is like imposed on the individual by angels or demons, and like there's pain and suffering put upon them from the outside, and they have to endure it. Where here it seems like it's more a response of the heart to their beloved. Is that so? Is Newman doing something quite original here in the tradition of this kind of, in this genre of sort of spiritual literary writing, or what? Yeah, go ahead.
It's not quite original. For one thing, the idea that both hell and heaven have to do with one's own choice, of course, is very ancient. Christ, I mean, in defense of the other position, Christ did talk about going to hell, which is not the place for humans at all, but the place prepared for the devil and his angels. So it is unnatural to humans to go to hell. Our natural desire is for God. That being said, remember in Dante's Purgatorio, at the very top, everyone has to deal with the fire having to do with lust, and they seek the fire. They don't want to, they're careful not to step outside the fire. It is your own desire that makes the pain of purgatory. And that is over and over emphasized in Dante. So Newman is being theologically very carefully accurate to make purgatory be something that is a consequence of one's desire for God and the encounter with the holiness of God. That's, it's not entirely original, but it is more theologically accurate than most depictions of the afterlife. Which you can understand.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Bernadette?
Yes, exactly. Oh, Joseph.
Yeah.
Bernadette, in Gerontis, the friends of his are praying for him,
Yes.
helping him along throughout the whole time, as opposed to Job's friends, who, when Job is suffering, they're trying to give him a theological reason and blame. You think Newman is trying to use the friends to show us how we are to support one another, rather than how we a lot of times act like Job's friends?
Oh, absolutely. He wants us to look at the friends and see the support. He loves the support of the community. And so he quotes a long section of the litany. He quotes the Subvenite. I mean, it is, usually those prayers would be at a funeral mass, but they could be said at the bedside if people were fortunate enough to have people around the bedside who could do it. So yes, he's thinking of the support of the Christian community as really essential. And so we see them at the beginning and we see them at the judgment seat of God. They really are a help to him. And you'll notice when his friends first pray for him, he's saying, "I can no more." And they pray for him and suddenly he says, "Rouse my soul and play the man." And then he sings his, his statement of faith. So yes, the support of friends, the support of the community is, well, our friends are part of our extended body, really. Your friends, your family, you have a little core of self, you have a body, you have a culture, you have people around you. And all of these things are part of what comes back. What is the at the resurrection of the body, we'll understand all those interrelations. So that's really part of what's going on here. And you'll see it reflected more in in some of the work of Jared Manley Hopkins, who was, of course, Newman's friend and protege. Anybody else? There are a lot of little blank things. Joseph Pierce spoke to me out of the darkness of no camera. So.
Right. Yeah, anyone else?
If we have time, I was wondering if
Yeah, go for it.
you would be able to cite any more examples of people who would claim that the dream was one of the most significant works of Newman's for their conversion. I've heard of a lot of people personally who have said that this was of everything they've read of Newman's, this would be this was most significant in their in imaginative sense for their conversion. I don't know, you cited at least one other conversion that's related to the dream. Do you have any other examples of, or would you say that this is something you've experienced too?
I certainly have been educated by it. I mean, I was already pretty Catholic before I was reading The Dream of Gerontius. He has educated me and turned me toward certain things. This vision of the terrible fire of God, because it is so beautiful. I don't know of conversions, but I mean, I'm thinking in literary terms, and I didn't go into people's biographies, but in the Screwtape Letters, C.S. Lewis, who did read Newman quite a bit, there is some contention that he didn't, but I know of 6 places where he's referring to Newman directly. But indirectly, in the Screwtape Letters, he has the devils horrified by the brightness of the face of God, which they can't face. They look upon it, and it is their agony if they try to look on God, so they have to stay away. So he uses that. He uses Newman's trope in that very popular book, which has doubtless had consequences in many people's lives. I know that my husband was partly the reading of the Screwtape Letters was, for my husband, the preliminary to his conversion, and it is the influence of Newman. You have this fragrance of sanctity that spreads out into all sorts of places. So I can't give you any more literary examples, but I do know that the image comes up, and not from and was less common before Lewis. Before Newman, Lewis picked it up from Newman.
Thank you.
Anybody else? Oh, come now, I haven't said everything there is to say about Gerontius. Well, Matt, what shall we do?
I guess we can wrap it up. Unless someone else wants to jump in with one more question last.
Yeah, we do
We'll
have
have like
time. We have about 5 minutes for another question.
Yeah, 5 minutes. So.
Well, Barbara,
Well, I'll ask you a question. Oh, yes, good. Father Jerome, thank you.
Father Jerome from St. Anselm. And it just maybe to step out of the poem a little bit and talk about the reception of the poem a little bit more, and maybe fill us in as you kind of started about conditions that warranted a reaction. I just find what you have to say fascinating in the literary terms, but also in a sense, in terms of our present moment and the, on one hand, the lack of concern on the part of some people, and on the other hand, the excessive fears on the part of others, which I think the poem helps light up a little bit. But just maybe talk about the reception of the poem at the time of its publication.
It was tremendously well received. You had people, it went through many editions very quickly. It became a standard piece of Victorian poetry. As popular among Protestants as among Catholics. I mean, here it was printed in a Jesuit magazine. The Jesuits must have made a killing off this because it was reprinted and reprinted and reprinted. General Gordon, who was killed by Islamists in Khartoum at the end of the 19th century, in one of the many, it was an ISIS-like movement. They thought that they were creating a caliphate, and they had someone that they thought was the Mahdi. And so General Gordon went to put down the rebellion and the swath of murder that went with it. And when he was finally trapped in a compound without sufficient reserves coming to rescue them, he knew he was going to die. And in fact, he was killed by a dozen spears. What he had in his back pocket was a copy of The Dream of Gerontius.
Amazing.
Yeah. So people brought this with them and carried it with them and used it as a way of preparing for death. And it redirected the Victorian concentration on sadness and mourning. I mean, people had, not only was there special mourning stationery, but there were charts in the department stores telling you how long you had to wear black, and 2 years for a widow, certain amount of time due to your degree of relation. All of this concentration on the sadness of loss, he refocused toward the goodness of encountering God and how to discipline your life in that direction. The tremendous depth of the poem, the theological depth, not often understood, often not explicitly understood, really moved people. And so that's important to the reception of the dream, how deeply its theological understanding imbued it, so that things that people would not particularly adhere to abstractly, they were able to adhere to imaginatively. And Newman knew that the way you get people to understand what's going on is through the imagination. He says that in Grammar of Assent. He says that in various of his sermons. He says this in other ways in The Idea of a University. He understands that the imagination is a kind of experience, and in fact, we experience things through our minds, our imaginations. And so the Dream of Gerontius is giving you rich theology imaginatively. And that is what moved people so strongly. I think we're out of time.
Thank you.
Is that the case, Matt?
Yeah, I think, we're out of time. That was a great way to finish it up. We're out of time. So that was a great way to finish it up. I won't say anything else. And I'll end this meeting, and then we'll have another one in 9 to 7 minutes or something like that.
9 minutes.
Whatever time it is, 9 minutes. And thanks everybody for joining in and for the questions and for this great presentation.
Okay, God bless. I'll see you at
I feel
another.
more equipped to teach.
Okay, bye-bye.
Yeah.
Thanks.
All right.
Bye.